Good afternoon. I'm Julie Sweetkind-Singer, the Associate University Librarian for Collections and Public Services. It's my pleasure today to welcome you in person and to our live audience via Zoom to the 16th Dr. Sam-Chung Hsieh Memorial Lecture. As the intellectual nexus on campus, the Stanford University Libraries offers students, faculty, and scholars online and offline environments to explore, investigate, and collaborate. With a network of more than 20 libraries and centers, visitors can engage with primary resources, connect with journal articles, databases, and data, partner with subject matter experts for assignments and research, and discover ways to access and manipulate collections in digital libraries across the globe. Before we introduce today's speaker, I would like to tell you a bit about the history of the Hsieh Memorial Lecture. The family of Dr. Sam-Chung Hsieh, who are tuning in today online, donated his personal archive to Stanford Library Special Collections and endowed the Dr. Sam-Chung Hsieh Memorial Lecture Series in honor of his legacy and to inspire future generations. Dr. Hsieh was born November 13, 1919, in Guangdong, mainland China. He received his PhD in production economics from the University of Minnesota. He began his career with the Sino-American Joint Commission on Rural Construction, or JCRR, in Taiwan as senior specialist, chief economist, and later Secretary General. He served as professor at the National Taiwan University and as a visiting professor at the Ford Foundation-sponsored University of Philippines, Cornell University Joint Graduate Program. When the Asian Development Bank, ADB, was first established in Manila, Philippines in 1966, he served as director of the Projects Department until 1981, when he returned to Taiwan to become deputy chairman of the Council for Economic Planning and Development. From 1983 to 1989, he was chairman of the Bank of Communications, Taiwan's National Development Bank. He was appointed as governor of the Central Bank of China, a position he held from 1989 to 1994. From 1994 to 1999, he served as the chairman of the executive board of the China Trust Bank. From 1999 to 2003, he served as the chairman of the Industrial Bank of Taiwan. Additionally, he served as a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Rice Research Institute, IRRI, a member of the Board of Directors of the Metropolitan Bank and Trust in Manila, Philippines, chairman of the Tsinghua Institution for Economic Research, and as deputy chairman of the Cross-Straits Exchanges Relations Council with mainland China. Dr. Hsieh was married to Alice Hsieh for 58 years. They have 2 sons, 2 daughters, and 11 grandchildren. He passed away on April 24, 2004, in Los Angeles, California. He was 85 years old. This slide and the next slide show a listing of the past speakers in this lecture series. As you can see, we have been very fortunate to have an incredible selection of speakers over the years, and we are delighted to include Professor Hsieh in this group. With that, I will hand it over to Yiqing Xu, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, to introduce today's guest speaker.
Thank you, Julie. Hello, everyone. Thank you to the wonderful Stanford University Library team for co-hosting this event. Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's lecture by our very special guest, Professor Chang-Tai Hsieh. I'm very delighted to be here to welcome you on behalf of co-directors Scott Rozelle and Hongbin Li of SCI, Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions. They are senior fellows at SIPA and the FSI. Stanford Libraries and SCI have partnered since 2019 to bring the Hsieh Memorial Lecture to campus, and we are thrilled to collaborate again on this year's lecture. For those of you who have not heard of SCI, let me offer a brief introduction. SCI is Stanford's home for data-driven, empirical, multidisciplinary research on Chinese economy. With over 30 researchers and faculty affiliates, the center conducts research on a wide range of topics related to China. Our goal at SCI is to promote cutting-edge, data-driven research to help the public better understand China's economy. Now, without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker, Professor Chang-Tai Hsieh. Professor Hsieh is the Phyllis and Irvin Winkelried Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. He is an elected member of Academia Sinica in Taiwan, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Econometric Society. He is also a two-time recipient of the Sun Yefang Award from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, widely regarded as the highest economics award in mainland China. There's no exaggeration to say that Professor Hsieh's scholarship, especially his research on misallocation, spatial economics, and development accounting, has influenced a generation of economists and social scientists, myself included. Since I was a grad student in Beijing, I've seen many scholars, especially junior scholars and grad students, following Professor Hsieh's footsteps and use his framework and tools to study China's economy. For today's program, Professor Hsieh will give his presentation, and then we will take questions from the audience. Please use the microphone when you ask questions so that the Zoom audience can hear you clearly. Today's event will be recorded, and the recording will be available soon after the event. Let's welcome Professor Hsieh.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. When I was invited to give this talk, I was told who was the funder of the talk. I said, okay, well, given the funder of the talk, I'm going to make this a talk about Taiwan. And I think this is the first time that the talk has ever been on Taiwan. And I thought that I'm going to talk about, so I've titled this talk, The Ghost of Plaza, okay? And hopefully it will be clear what I mean by the idea of the ghost of Plaza. So the way I want to begin is that there's a sense in which, in terms of economics and technology, Taiwan looks like it finally has made it. So there's just some basic facts that right now it sits right at the center of the AI revolution, and it also is a case that it specializes in AI hardware, and this is like the first technological revolution where the profits are in hardware, not in software. Like open AI, I don't think is ever going to make money, but the hardware part of the AI, I think is you're seeing profit margins of 60-70%. You see this in terms of the growth rate. In 2025, Taiwan had a 9% growth rate. First quarter 2026, it was just reported a few weeks ago, it had a growth rate of 14%. Just unprecedented growth rate. The Taiwanese stock market is now more valuable than the stock market of either the UK or Canada, like for the very, very first time. And you see this in terms of sort of Taiwan's share in global exports. So the share of exports in GDP in Taiwan went up from 50% to 75%. So there's a sense in which, these decades of let me just call it, of the effort to upgrade technology, upgrade your industry, it finally has worked, okay? What I want to say is that despite what looks like this success, economic policy, I'm going to say, is still governed by, I'm going to call it ghosts. ghost, and I'll be clear on what I mean. And what I mean by this ghost is, it's this view, this feeling that Taiwan is just one step away from economic disaster, right? There's it's a sense of insecurity, the sense and it might have been the case that this way of thinking and these policies might have been appropriate in the 1950s and the 1960s, but what I'm going to argue to you is that they have two very important consequences now for thinking about Taiwan's economy. One is that it has very, very serious negative distributional consequences. And the second thing I want to say, perhaps even more important, is that despite sort of the goal of these policies is in response to this sense of economic insecurity, my belief is that it has made the risks that Taiwan faces just exponentially larger. So let me put it this way: that it's basically a combination of where Taiwan is now. Is that on the one hand, the economy is incredibly successful, and on the other hand, the economic policy, and more important, sort of the economic ideology, is still stuck where it was 30, 40 years ago, and that combination is generating huge risks to the economy. So let me build up my story in several acts. Okay. So the first thing I want to show you is who has benefited from the economic boom in Taiwan. So everybody knows that there has been, a huge boom in Taiwan. Let me show you the first fact, which is the labor share in Taiwan. That it's been falling like a rock. It's been falling like a rock. That this is the period. So this is a period where growth has been very, very high, but the benefits of the growth has gone to the owners of the firms and has not gone to the workers. Okay, so there's the second thing I want to show you is this is the consumption share of GDP of Taiwan. So the other thing that you see is that growth has been associated with a decline in the consumption share of GDP. So distributionally, it doesn't look like workers and consumers have been benefiting from the huge economic boom. Okay, so what I want to argue to you is that this is not an accident. Okay, or maybe another way to put this is that the way that I think the mainstream opinion in Taiwan look at these facts, and they basically say no, they don't view this as a problem. They view this as the essential outcome of let me just call it a growth strategy. And maybe the way that I think that I found this quote by Morris Zhang, which I think expresses this idea incredibly well, right? So this was in an interview that he was giving to the Wall Street Journal, and this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And the Wall Street Journal was basically bugging him about all the complaints by American workers in TSMC Arizona about the lack of a work-life balance in TSMC Arizona. And this is what Morris said. He said, these people, he'll specifically talk about American workers, right? American workers. They talk about work-life balance. That is a term that I didn't even know when I was their age. Work-life balance, and you can almost see him snorting, right? When he's saying this. When I was their age, if there was no work, there was no life. There was no life. And I would say that this is really the dominant view. This is the dominant view, not just among elites, not just among elites, but it's a pretty widespread view. And let me just call it sort of the view that we have to sacrifice for the sake of our livelihoods. We have to sacrifice because we're just one step away from economic disaster, one step away, and so we've just got to, sacrifice extra hard. for this. And you see this in terms of labor policy, right? So it's labor policy. So I'll just give you one example. In Taiwan, there's a widespread use of non-compete agreements, and people view this as being completely normal. So what do non-competes do? It basically restricts your wages and it prevents you from going to another firm, right? For another firm. The manifestation of this I don't know what you would call it, right? This view or this ideology, in terms of macro policy, it shows up in terms of how policymakers think about the exchange rate, okay? And this going to tie in to the funder of this talk. But it's not just the Central Bank of Taiwan, but it's also all the key economic policy makers of Taiwan. And the phrase is that it is hugely important to keep the exchange rate competitive for our livelihoods. Like we've got to, an important part is that we've got to keep wages low, and we've got to keep our products competitively priced, competitive price, so that we can maintain our livelihood. So let me just summarize this view that competitiveness, economic survival requires restraints on wages, and it requires restraints on our domestic consumption. So the two figures that I showed you before, that is not an accident. It's not an accident. So it's a feature, right? It's a feature of economic policy. So that's sort of the background of sort of the way that people think about the world. Okay, let me go to Act 1. Okay, when did this view become solidified in economic policy? It became solidified in economic policy after the 1985 US-Japan Plaza Agreement. And basically what happened was under the threat of a trade war, the US forced Japan to appreciate its currency, appreciate the currency. And then there's a widespread view, not just in Taiwan, but I find people make the same argument in China, make the same argument in Korea, that this was why Japan went into economic decline, right? I will say that it's a pretty hard, I would say that it's really hard to make sense of that argument, but I'm not here to say what makes sense or what doesn't make sense. My talk is about what do people believe, right? And this is a widespread belief, and then there's this basic fact that what happened to Japan is that it was growing by 10% a year. After Plaza, its growth fell to 2 or 3% a year. Before Plaza, companies like Sony were at the center of the world. After Plaza, Sony went into decline, and what was the last product you ever bought from Sony? Okay, so it's obviously very complex. So I want to say here that, I don't believe that this narrative about Plaza is correct. I don't believe that sort of this view of that this is the way that you should do economic policy, that you should force workers to sacrifice and you should lower consumption is what drives growth, right? But I'm going to put that aside because that's not my point. My point is, what do people believe, okay? And I will also say that Taiwan went through its own version of Plaza, so this has not been reported that widely, but it was Taiwan and Japan that was targeted by the Reagan administration in 1985. Okay, so let me show you what happened in Taiwan after 1985. Okay, so what did the Reagan administration do? It basically forced Taiwan to appreciate its currency from 40 NT dollar to about 26, 27, 27. And this is what happened in Taiwan. There was a big fall in the current account surplus of Taiwan, current account surplus. So Governor Hsieh came at the tail end of this process. I forgot your date, 1989. So he came into office after all this appreciation had already happened, and he basically navigated the fallout from this, or the perceived fallout. And there's a view among elites in Taiwan that this was an economic disaster. This was that what Taiwan agreed in 1985 was an economic disaster, and we're never ever going to do that we're never ever going to do that again. Now it's sort of hard to tell because this was also the time when China was opening up to. I mean, essentially what happened in Taiwan right after the appreciation, you see the huge relocation of Taiwanese firms to China. How much of it was coming from the appreciation of the NT dollar? How much of it was coming from the opening of China? It's impossible to tell. Right, and I will also say that my view of the economic history of Taiwan over this period, I think it's actually more. I don't think that it's that clear that the appreciation was a bad thing for Taiwan, because that was really the beginning. This was really the period of the beginning of the semiconductor industry in Taiwan. This was the period where what you saw is the gradual upgrading of lots and lots of companies in Taiwan. So I would say again that there's this view. I don't think the view is correct, but still it's the view, right? It's the view, and these are the people that matter in terms of policy. So then, ever since 1995, there was I'm going to say, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. There was basically this concerted effort to basically to prevent this thing from ever happening again. Okay, and it meshed very nicely with sort of this view that we have to sacrifice. Okay, so let me show you what happened after 1995. So this is so what happened after 1995 is that Taiwan's economy grew. Okay. And the current account balance, the current account surplus soared as the economy became successful. So last year, Taiwan had a current account surplus of 20% of GDP. Okay? No other country in the world has a current account that's this big. So those of you who follow China, what is China's current account surplus? There's all this talk about in terms of percent of GDP, about all the problems caused by Chinese excess capacity, right? It's 3, right? So China has a current account surplus of 3% of GDP. It's the difference between exports and imports. Not completely, right? It's also net of income flows as well, but it's mostly exports minus imports. So no other country even comes close. Even comes close. This year, my prediction is that it's going to reach 25% of GDP. Okay. In every country in the world, when your current account starts to go up, there are pressures on the exchange rate. Right. It's just the natural functioning of the market. When you export a lot, right, then the value of your currency starts to go up. And that brings the current account back into balance a little bit. But this is what's happened in Taiwan. That this is the NT dollar exchange rate with respect to the exchange rate of the NT dollar with respect to the Taiwan dollar. And despite sort of and it's not just a 1-year surge, it's this 20-year-long increase in the surplus. There's been no change there's been no change in the exchange rate, which is really hard to accomplish. Okay, but what I want to suggest that this was explicit policy such that we have growth and we're never ever going to lose our competitiveness ever again in the way that we did in the aftermath of 1985. Okay, so what happened then? Okay, the first round. So let me just call this Act 2 now. Okay, Act 2. The way you typically what you typically do to prevent your exchange rate from appreciating is that you buy foreign currency. Okay? Who does that? It's the central bank. Okay? So Act 1 is basically massive accumulation of foreign currency by the central bank. So what you see after 1995 is just a huge. So what is this? It's basically printing Taiwan dollars and using the money to buy foreign exchange, to essentially buy U.S. Treasury bills to try to prevent the NT dollar from appreciating. Okay. So the number now is that Taiwan central bank has about $600 billion in reserves. Okay. Now, Act 2 is that the current account surplus, the pressure on the exchange rate was so big that even this was not enough. Okay, even this was not enough. It was not enough. So Act 2 comes roughly in, say, the 2015 or so. Okay, in Act 2, the key player in Taiwan is the life insurance industry. Okay, so think about the basic problem. Okay, the basic problem is that you're getting all this inflow of money from your exports, and so there's an imbalance between supply and demand. So you've got to do something about it. Okay, but you can initially the effort to deal with it was through purchases by the central bank. Okay, but that was not enough to deal with it. So the phase number 2 was there was a growing life insurance industry in Taiwan. Okay, and maybe the way you want to think about life insurance is that it's like a bank, right? It's like a bank. That is, you make your payments to the life insurance company, and in exchange, you get a promise that when something happens to you, they're going to give you your money back, right? So it's essentially a bank. So the question is, what does the life insurance industry, the life insurance company, what do they do with your premiums? Okay? Now, think about it in the following way. Okay? Their promises to you, which are Taiwanese families, okay? The liabilities are in NT dollars. Okay? The way they make money is that they take your premiums, they invest it in assets, and hopefully the return on the assets is greater than what they have to pay you when you die or whenever. Okay? What was going on at the time was that part of the actions of the central bank was to keep the interest rates in Taiwan low. Okay? So they were highly incentivized to, instead of investing their assets in Taiwan dollars, to invest it in US assets, which offered a higher rate of return. But what's the problem of that? Okay? It leads to a currency mismatch, right? It's exactly what led to the Asian financial crisis, where there was a mismatch between assets and liabilities. So the way to think about it is that if you buy too much, if all your assets are denominated in US dollars and your liabilities are in Taiwan dollars, okay, when the NT dollar appreciates, then the value of your dollar assets become low relative to what you have promised to Taiwanese families. Okay? So there's a huge risk there. So in response to that risk, the initial rules for the life insurance companies was that they limited the share of dollar assets in the portfolio of the life insurance companies to 45%. Okay? But then came this other pressure that, we've got to get we've got to relax the pressure on the NT dollar to appreciate. So what happened then initially was, starting in 2015, what you saw was the emergence of what I'm going to call loopholes. So the first loophole, okay, was they put in place a rule that said, if the life insurance company bought a foreign currency bond, a dollar bond, but that bond happened to be traded in the Taipei Stock Exchange, that doesn't count as a foreign currency asset. Okay, but obviously it's a foreign. It doesn't matter whether it's traded in New York or whether it's traded in Taiwan. The fact that that it's denominated in U.S. dollars means that it faces exactly the same currency risk. The second loophole was that they put in place a rule that if you could buy what's called an exchange-traded fund, this is maybe getting too much into finance for you, but an exchange-traded fund that's backed by foreign currency bonds, that also doesn't count as a foreign currency asset. So as a consequence of these loopholes, and I will say one more thing, right? Also starting in 2015, what the central bank started to do is that they started to provide foreign currency hedges for the life insurance companies that they didn't disclose at all. The central bank did not disclose at all on their balance sheet. Okay? So the consequence, starting in 2015, was that the life insurance companies started to buy lots and lots of foreign currency assets. They did so because they get a higher rate of return. Okay? It comes with this currency risk, and then I'll talk about then how I think they're thinking about the currency risk. So by the time you get to 2022 or so, okay, the life insurance, two things had happened to the life insurance companies. They had grown by leaps and bounds. Second, most of their assets, despite the 45% rule, was denominated in US dollars. So something like 90% of their assets were denominated in US dollars. So let me just show you the numbers. This is the run-up in the assets, the dollar-denominated assets of Taiwan's life insurance companies. So you can see that by 2020, 2021, it had reached $700 billion. So it was larger than the foreign currency assets of the central bank. Central bank was about $600 billion. So what is this? This is basically just buildup of enormous risk. Buildup of enormous risk in the economy. For what purpose? To prevent the NT dollar from the NT dollar from appreciating. Okay, so it's this. So this is what I'm going to call sort of the ghost of Plaza. Like it's a fear of this ghost, and they started. So again, it's the central bank. That was not enough. So then they doubled down by getting the life insurance companies to do this, who did this gladly because it offered them a higher rate of return. Okay?
Is South Korea similar?
I'm sorry?
South Korea is similar?
I don't know about South Korea. Yeah, I don't know. This gets me to Act 3. So there are 4 acts in total. We all know about Liberation Day last year, right? The consequence for Liberation Day in Taiwan is there was a huge run on the US dollar in the foreign exchange market in Taiwan. Because everybody believed that this was going to be the next thing that was going to come down. People were going to look at the 20% surplus and say, oh my God, this is politically unsustainable for the US. So over 2 days, there was essentially a foreign currency crisis. Okay, but that went the other way. Most of the time, the media reports a foreign currency crisis in places like Argentina, where it's a run on the local currency. This was a run on the US dollar. Right? This was a run on the US dollar. So in the course of 2 days, okay, the currency run forced a 12% appreciation of the NT dollar. It went from 32 to 29 in just 2 days. Now, think about what this did to the balance sheet. It basically killed the balance sheet of the life insurance companies. That if you look at the value of their assets and the value of their liabilities, they were effectively bankrupt. Okay, that's when we get to Act 3. Okay, immediately after the currency run, the regulator said, okay, we are gonna change our accounting rules such that you no longer have to use what's called mark-to-market accounting, which means that if the value of a US dollar assets goes down in value, you don't have to report it. And they had a justification that they believe that you shouldn't implement accounting rules in response to short-run changes in the value of the currency. Okay, what happened like immediately afterwards was the life insurance companies. They have some hedges on their foreign currency assets, which they have assets. They purchase instruments such that if the dollar were to appreciate, they would be covered. And roughly, they had a hedging ratio of about 60%. Okay, immediately after the change in accounting rules, okay, what you see on their balance sheet is that they lower the hedging ratio by about 20%. Okay, and just keep in mind the magnitude of the numbers. You have overall assets of $800 or so billion. 20% is a lot. Okay, what did this do? The immediate effect was that in last year, this I think was the biggest force that basically removed the pressure on the market to get the NT dollar to appreciate. Okay, so it solves, I'm going to say, the plaza problem, or the forces of the market to push the NT dollar to appreciate. It solved the short run problem, but it obviously generates a long run problem, which is then sort of this imbalance is even larger, right? The imbalance is even larger, so so the long run risk has increased exponentially. So the way that you want to think about it is that in the effort to try to keep the exchange rate competitive, or what's happened is that there's been the creation of this enormous financial institution whose survival depends on avoiding an appreciation. Okay, so you can see how this makes sort of this issue even much harder to solve, because anything that you want to do that would make sense for the exchange rate is going to cause a financial collapse. So this takes me to Act 4, which is what I'm seeing now. If you double down on sort of trying to keep your exchange rate undervalued, that's going to make the external surplus problem even worse, or even larger. Okay? The solution that I'm seeing of the way that I think that they're thinking about dealing with this, that is, what do you do when you are the largest surplus country in the world, or largest surplus country in the world? And this, I think, they took their cue from the Trump administration. So their solution now is, the way that we're going to solve this problem is that instead of investing our money in treasury bills, okay, we're going to invest our money in foreign direct investment. Okay, so the way that I think the way that you want to think about it is that it's just switch the composition of your assets from treasury bills to outbound foreign direct to outbound, and this mostly takes three forms, right? There's a $500 billion investment pledge, right? That was part of the U.S.-Taiwan trade agreement. The other big piece of what the plan is, and this was not in the agreement, is to basically, the vision is to basically export the Taiwan Science Park model. So the vision now is that Taiwan is going to go out primarily to the US and build a whole bunch of science parks. And these parks would be places where Taiwanese firms would set up in the US. Okay? So you think about what that does is that it relaxes the political pressure in the U.S., which is what they learned from the Trump, administration. I would say that in January of 2025, Taiwanese policymakers, they were terrified that the U.S. was going to look at the 20% surplus and was going to do something. It turns out that they weren't focused at all on the surplus. What they wanted was the investment, right? So it doesn't matter. So the lesson that they took is that, well, maybe we can deal with the problem with sort of the political problem of the surplus by implementing the Trump solution to the problem, which is but you think about what this does, right? This is what I call a doubling down on this model, right? It's a doubling because what it does is that it further increases I'm going to say profits of firms, and it further and so if this model is successful, what it's going to mean is that sort of if there's any gains from doing this, none of it is going to go to the workers. It's going to go to the firms. Okay. So this is where we are now, right? So the way I'm going to say this is that it's very much, I call this, again, to go back to my title, it's the ghost of Plaza, right? It's like the economy has become incredibly successful, but they behave because they're frightened by this ghost, right? This ghost of the ghost of Plaza, and it's generating, also, a way I'm going to put it is that it solved this problem, but the institutions that they thought are going to are built to solve the problem of competitiveness, they live on and they take on a life of their own, right? And this is, I think, has three consequences. Number one, it means that workers in Taiwan never get the benefit. It's still the case that wages in Taiwan are among like the lowest in Asia, right? And it generates two big risks. One is the risk of the financial system, right? And you can see that, they didn't think through, if you get these life insurance companies to do it, then what happens when these life insurance companies get really big? And the second one is sort of the longstanding problem, the longstanding risk of, at what point, is the external surplus too big? Like, how long can you hide the fact that you're running the largest current account surplus in the world? Are you going to get to 25%, 30%? Nobody ever gets nobody has more than 5%. No country in the world has more than 5%. So 20, even the 20 now is just so imbalanced, I'm going to say. So it's imbalanced in terms of the consequences for the world, and it's obviously a huge imbalance for people in Taiwan. I think it hurts Taiwan because they have 20% less consumption. That's a way that you want to think about it. So it's the consumers and the workers that continue to sacrifice, and my prediction is that they will continue to sacrifice.
How much is the imbalance due to TSMC when it comes?
No. The way that you want to think about it is that there's like, if you have, in a normally functioning economy, if you have a surge in exports because one company is incredibly successful, what you see everywhere else in the world is that your currency appreciates and you buy more from the rest of the world in the medium run. That doesn't happen in Taiwan. So it's almost it's maybe the analogy is that, Hong Bin, you get a huge pay raise and your income triples, right? Your income triples, but you are forced not to do anything with the additional income that you have. You cannot buy a new car. You cannot buy a new apartment. You behave as if you are still a graduate student at Stanford. I'm not saying that's true, but that's sort of an analogy of how to think about the situation of Taiwan now, right? And for those who want to talk about sort of culture and ideology, there's a whole ideology and a culture campaign about trying to, about how this is just normal, right? This is just normal. That is, you have to sacrifice, all right? So let me pause here, take your questions.
Thank you for the framework. And I think that, first of all, maybe we'll get to the ghost in the plaza after this, but I want to go back to visiting the initial foundation that this is an amazing economy, right? Having followed Taiwan's tech sort of economy so far, I see the same story. You get the first hardware, but it's a cost down every year. and you make your 5% margin. There's a lot of money to be made in that, but it's 5%. This one's bigger initially, but it's going to be the same thing because the IP is not in Taiwan. It's in NVIDIA. The IP is in the chip designers, not necessarily TSMC. TSMC's gotten better, so it's a little bit better. But when you look at the whole economy, I say it's still very, very risky, and therefore, if there's a ghost, it's bigger than ever before from the assumption standpoint, economic success so-called. So if that's the case, I think the mentality holds, policy-wise, culturally, but I think the undercurrent maybe you're going to get to is the culture of the disparity between the 30 family that owns everything and the workers. And in fact, 90% of work in all these conglomerates say there's no way for them to move up. They're just, kids are just doing their stuff now, right? So I'm looking at all these pressure, if anything, building more towards the bigger ghost and the bigger fall. I don't know if that fits in with your framework.
I would say that sort of empirically, I understand that is the perception in Taiwan. When you look at the data, the sort of margins on aggregate have gone up by quite a bit over the last 20 years. Like the profit rate has gone up. So sort of this view that we are surviving on tiny margins, and if something were to happen to the exchange rate, we're going to die. That may be true for some companies, but in aggregate, it's increasingly not true, right? But I would say just come back that there are two issues. One is I'm going to say the domestic political issue of workers not benefiting from their work. Right, not benefiting from the work in terms of wages and not benefiting from the work in terms of their expenditures, right? So you can, I will say with propaganda, you can handle that, right?
More pressure than ever before, more business.
Right, but I would say that the biggest risk, right? The biggest immediate risk is the risk of a financial collapse of the life insurance company, and then the second risk is the potential backlash from the rest of the world when they realize that, hey, why have you been exporting more than what you're buying from us to the tune of 25% of GDP for 20 years, right? It's not just a one-year thing. It's been long going, right? It's a long going and rising, right? So far, that backlash hasn't happened. That second backlash hasn't happened yet. Right? And this is sort of, again, what I say that in Taiwan, they took from the Trump administration. So sort of that pressure for investment deals, I think that was God sent. Like, oh, we can deal with this problem.
Thank you so much, which was a very, very educational session for me. I'm from South Korea. I'm a visiting scholar here in Jeonglim. I'm an IR actually professor, but we have a very fascinating, probably comparative case in Korea, SK Hynix versus like a Samsung Electronic. And you might notice, but these days, again, Samsung Electronic, they are struggling with the massive protest. What basically they are arguing is, what you just told us, more incentives, because SK Hynix, their employee, they got much more incentives, all this like bonus kind of things compared to Samsung Electronic. But well, I agree with you. Probably the income level of employee that can contribute to the national economy, but at the same time, you also need to think about comparative advantage or like a competitiveness of those manufacturing companies. So how would you assess those two different cases? Again, the SK Hynix versus like Samsung or TSMC. I think my question can be a kind of follow-up question.
I just think that what you got to do is that you just got to create a level playing field. I mean, you just got to create. You just got to create you don't want to. I'm going to say create institutions that pay workers more than what they contribute. You also don't want to have institutions that pay workers less than what they contribute, right? And I'm saying that Taiwan is on one side of that. I don't know enough about Korea to know which side that it's which side is on. What you want to do is that whenever a worker contributes, they should get paid, right? They should get paid. They shouldn't get paid more. They shouldn't get paid less. They should just get paid, right? For what they contribute to the firm, right?
I'm sorry. That is why these days, again, even in Korea, to the big debates. Again, which company should we, again, invest further? Again, Samsung, they have probably more capital power to reinvest, whereas, again, the SK Hynix might not be.
No, that's right. But then you've got to think about, obviously, it's great for companies to pay their workers nothing. Right? Let's just establish that, right? Obviously, we think that that's not optimal, right? Even though it's great for a company to pay its workers as little, if they can get away with nothing, maybe I'll say this, right? 15 years ago, I was in the faculty at UC Berkeley, and I don't know how much you guys know this, but the Berkeley or the UC system has this rule that if you get an offer from another UC school, the other UC school couldn't pay you a penny more. Right, that's a system, right? And it's very clear why it makes sense. It makes sense to them, but who got screwed? It's a faculty that got screwed. So again, you want to think about some things are good for companies, but they're not necessarily what you want optimally, right? The same goes. I want to be clear that you also don't want to overdo it on the other side. That is, you don't want to have a system where workers get paid more than what they're actually contributing, because that also leads to big problems, right? You got to get the balance, right?
Thank you for the session. So these days, people talk a lot about the population growth and decline in Taiwan.
Yep.
So given the recent trends in demographics, do you envision any complexities that it could further put into this equation that you just explained today?
I think that's something different. I mean, it's not just a Taiwan thing, right? Like all over Asia, there's just been a vast, we could have a whole talk about why there's been a vast decline, but it's about what you see in Taiwan is about the same level. What you see in South Korea is a very low. It's about the same level as what you see in China. And let me talk to you offline about what I think could be causing that, right? I think it's a fascinating topic of what that is, but I think that's something that's orthogonal to this subject.
At the risk of asking a naive question, how much of the current account surplus that Taiwan has, and the perhaps restrictions on abilities to address this can be attributed to Taiwan's relative isolation, sort of diplomatically, in the world? In other words, are there things that, you could say that this sense of fear, right, is part of that is Taiwan's precarious kind of diplomatic stage. But I was just thinking about the foreign direct investment part. Like, if Taiwan is, how much of that can the Taiwanese government actually promote when it is not really able to act openly, especially in smaller countries where the risk of sort of China getting in the way of too much activity might cause problems for the host country.
Yeah,
is there,
yeah,
on the political side, sort of the international politics of this, is there any contribution to what you've been talking about
let
today?
me say that the solution to a current account surplus or to a current account deficit, that is, we have, I'm going to say, so many, we have an abundance of evidence of what brings a current account surplus to an end or lowers the current account surplus, and what brings a current account deficit to an end, which is that the markets operate and the exchange rate either appreciates or the exchange rate depreciates. There's literally tens of thousands of episodes of observations that this is how it happens. Now, in this case, you have a government that doesn't want the appreciation because of what I'm going to call the ghost, and you do something about it, and the appreciation is something that you can actually do something about. We also have lots and lots of evidence of episodes on the other side when market forces are pushing for a depreciation and the government doesn't like it. Now, that's actually harder to do. What was that? That was the 1998 Asian financial crisis, because you eventually run out of your foreign currency reserves. Right, so again, it's not quite sure how to emphasize that this is just the market operating, right? This is just the market operating. So dealing with it is not rocket science. It's not rocket science. It's the simplest thing in the world. Let prices adjust. Okay, just let prices adjust. And what's happening here is that there's been this explicit effort through these 3 acts not to let market prices adjust. That's essentially the story that I'm telling. Now, we've got to the point now where this is sort of my point about the life insurance industry, that if Taiwan ever make the decision to let market prices operate, to let markets adjust, then they have the problem of the life insurance industry that is going to collapse, right? So they basically doubled down. They created this institution such that it's become impossible. So they could have done this 20 years ago with no problem. There would be no financial crisis. But now they have to deal with, what do you do with the $900 billion of U.S. foreign currency assets that is going to fall in value as soon as you let as soon as you let market prices adjust. About the second part of your question, I don't think there's, you know, everybody loves foreign direct investment, and they don't. I don't see any. I don't see any political constraints whatsoever. Like in terms of, you know, they don't want Taiwan's president in the country, but they would gladly take. They would gladly take your technology and your factories. So I don't see that as an issue.
Thank you. I think we could go on for a long time with questions, but we'll wrap it up there for our audience here and for those online. But would you please please all of you join me in thanking Professor Hsieh for talking with us today about the risk of Taiwan's economic boom. We greatly appreciate you speaking at this memorial lecture for us today. I'd also like to give another couple of thanks. One is to Xiaowei Xu, our Chinese Studies librarian, Sonia Lee, the Associate Director for Development in the Libraries, and Heather Rahimi of Sky for their planning and coordination of today's events. Let's also thank Sky for their continued support and participation in this lecture series. So let's enjoy some reception. Let's have some more questions and talks. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks.